Quilts are often used to tell stories, and Dominique Ehrman, besides being a world-class technician for building and making quilts, is a world-class storyteller. All of her quilts tell stories. This one is a very interesting one because it is a time machine steampunk quilt. The Binney family, at the end of their collecting, the father was the prime collector for gorgeous quilts. Many collected without the history that came along with them, but collected for their exhibitability, for their visual quality. And they, in the 1990s, began giving us quilts. We start the story with the flat quilt, and I want you to notice the girl, the antelope, the raven, and the fox. The quilt gets sucked into the time machine. It gets chewed up into little pieces. It goes through the tubes. How cool is that? Through one more set of tubes, begins to spit out what you saw on that quilt in 3D. And here she is in all her 3-dimensional glory. Her friend the antelope, her friend the fox, and using 3-dimensional technique, which we rarely see in quilting, has told a wonderful story of the imagination. The part of my family background that has to do with me sitting here right now is that many of the women in my family are craftspeople or were craftspeople. And what I love most about my job is I get to exhibit beautiful pieces that can or can't be related to the history of quilting, but the history is also what I love. One of the most wonderful things about working with Dominique is the completeness of this exhibit. I mentioned earlier that she starts each piece with a rendering from a sketch. She provided us with 10, which we've made as part of the installation. She's used a new product in quilting. She's found a source for the kind of carpeting that you have in the trunk of your car, and she used it as the base for the kinetic movement piece. She was hanging a quilt up to dry and saw the effect of sunlight behind it and decided to share it with this wonderful piece that's backlit. She wanted the quilt to look like it was waving in the wind and very carefully pieced it so that the seams would add another dimension to the work. And it's lovely as a piece on its own without the backlighting, but it's also fabulous when it's lit. So we're going to go into the gallery that is named for Nancy Donahue, another major donor for us over the years. And our collections manager, Laura Lane, chose to select quilts from our collection that have trees on them. And it's a really wonderful thing that she's done because this is the quilt in our collection that has the earliest fabric. This center panel was probably printed in India as early as 1750. And it was once part of bed hangings in the beginning of the 1800s, in the 1700s, and into the 1800s. People, in order to be warmer, not only used quilts and blankets on their beds, but they draped them with curtains so that it would hold in the heat. And these are textiles that are recycled from that. Then she added a fabric from the 1830s and another fabric from the 1840s. There are lots of misconceptions about quilts. One of the first that I always talk about when I'm lecturing is the misconception that quilts are an American craft. The earliest evidence that we have of quilted textiles is a little tiny statue that's Egyptian, probably 5,000 years BCE. There is a Japanese tradition for quilting, Chinese, Italian, just any country that has cold nights is going to have layered textiles. What people don't understand is the difference between a blanket and a quilt. A blanket is one layer. A quilt is 3 layers. It has a top, which is usually decorated in some way, whether it's patchwork or embroidery or applique, which is cutting out small bits and applying them to the surface with stitching. It has a middle layer, which is what makes it warm. It's called batting or wadding. It can be cotton or wool or whatever is at hand. And then it has a backing, and those 3 layers are held together generally with a quilting stitch, which is a running stitch. But some quilts can also be tied, as long as you can figure out a good way to hold those layers together. My big battle in the world is to convince them that quilts can be art. Quilts have been used to give people lessons in difficult social issues. The ones that I like to talk most about are the American quilts. Early fundraising quilts had anti-slavery messages on them, and they were used in raffles. Quilts have been used to talk about the environment, to bring awareness to AIDS. The Names Project is a huge quilt. It covered the entire mall at Washington, D.C. Panels were made for people who died. But the quilting projects were also used to raise awareness and teach age-appropriate lessons about sex, drugs, and alcohol. Dr. Carolyn Maslumi's work was recently purchased and part of a major exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And she constructed a quilt using the images that are in the song Strange Fruit, sung by Billie Holiday, images of women and men hanging from a tree with a line of Ku Klux Klan members at the front of the quilt. Our museum is careful to change its exhibits every 3 months. We have glorious exhibits in our galleries now with string theory and Dominique Ehrman. But if you come in a couple of years from now, you'll find something equally as lovely. The only thing of interest, Colin, is that the family made its money in the crayon business. They were the family that founded Crayola crayons. So you might find something if you go down that avenue. It actually might be fun to include something very colorful about the background of the family.